This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything.
I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony, air quotes, Nippy, Ames.
And this is A Little Bit Culty, a podcast about what happens when things that seem like a great thing at first go bad.
Every week, we chat with survivors, experts, and whistleblowers for real cult stories told directly by the people who lived through them.
Because we want you to learn a few things we've had to learn the hard way.
Like, if you think you're too smart to get sucked into something culty, you're already prime recruitment material.
You might even already be in a cult.
Oops. You better keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Season 6 of A Little Bit Culty. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of A Little Bit Culty.
What up, peeps?
Today, we welcome former religious fundamentalist turned brilliant Jezebel, Dr. Laura Anderson. She's a psychotherapist specializing in the sneaky, many-headed hydra of high-control religion, and wrote a book that came out recently that we cannot recommend more loudly and heartily. That book is called When Religion Hurts You: Healing from Religious Trauma and the Impact of High-Control Religion.
It's a powerful read about the reality that culty church shit, or even secular culty shit that is churchy or dogmatic in its own way, can injure people in multiple ways and dimensions. And it doesn't always need to rise to the level of what you would traditionally be considered abuse to be an adverse experience that can really mess with you.
Dr. Anderson also writes about the simple but profound truth that healing isn't linear or something you can just check off a to-do list. Healing is always in process as long as you're breathing. And that one is so true and yet so easy to forget.
She's a one-stop shop on the road to religious trauma recovery. She's co-host of 2 podcasts. She's built healing organizations and training centers. She posts easy-to-chew insights on social media and a total powerhouse.
She's here to talk with us about how culty churches or even mainstream American religious communities or your culty as fuck personal development program can be traumatizing and what you can do about it.
Here's our chat on When Religion Hurts You with Dr. Laura Anderson.
Dr. Laura Anderson, welcome to A Little Bit Culty.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad we were able to make it work. And again, apologies for not attending your book launch, but here we are.
Yes. Better late than never, right?
Launch it now. Sarah.
Launch it, and I will launch it again here on A Little Bit Culty because I'm going to promote the shit out of this book.
Thank you.
I am obsessed. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's an hour earlier where I'm at, so I'm still a little bit waking up, but other than that, really good. That's what coffee's for.
We're on the same page. We've had our coffee. Nippy and I are still a little bit sick, but
5:45 for me.
Nippy woke up at 5:45 with the boys.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so fun.
No, it's a hoot.
It's great.
It's a real hoot. Yeah.
But we're here for it. And I have to tell you, I have to just admit something to you right off the top. I kind of we interview so many experts and we've talked about this for 3 years. Sometimes I'm like, can I really learn anything else? You know what I mean?
Totally.
Right? And also because I thought, well, I wasn't in a religion.
Right.
That I'd be learning for my audience and not so much for myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was wrong about both things.
Yeah.
I learned a lot from your book. And it's also I was in a fundamentalist cult.
Yeah.
Group. It wasn't a religion, but it was fundamentalist.
Yeah. There's a very similar, actually the same playbook that they all follow. They are very non-creative. Yeah. And so sometimes I use it all interchangeably, like fundamentalism, high control religion, cults, because they all have the same dynamics. There's not many differences other than ascribing to a higher power, and even that sometimes there can be that in cults.
Pretty formulaic, yeah.
Yeah, for my work at my company, we say, we specialize in, religious trauma, cults, fundamentalism, because it's all the same.
I feel like a lot of our audience might be like, oh, I wasn't in religion. This episode might not apply and maybe skip it. And I really am encouraging them not to, because I feel like the insights of what you write about in your book can help a lot of people just process the trauma and give them a roadmap specifically to evolve that trauma.
Oh, and also understand it when they see it in other people.
Yeah, and for sure. And also, that was the other thing I was going to admit to you, was that we had some people in our group who their PTSD was totally different, and I didn't really get it until reading your book. I was sort of like, like it's not that I didn't believe them. I just was like, I didn't have the requisite empathy, I don't think, until your book.
Yeah, that's a huge compliment, though. I really appreciate that, because I wanted to make the book as accessible to people, regardless of where they came up, while still not like offending large groups of people. And so when I hear feedback like, yeah, this is not how I grew up, but I absolutely see how, it applies to me, or I'm still in this religion, but you didn't bash it. And I'm like, okay, good. We're getting the goal that I've been hoping would be possible.
It's also kind of a spectrum as well, because when people were coming to us with our story, we could kind of recognize where they didn't have the requisite empathy to understand what they were looking at, not necessarily recognizing we were guilty of the same thing with other people who had different kinds of trauma or more trauma.
Or just a different trauma response.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Because it wasn't my trauma response.
That's better put.
Yeah. Well, and that's true, because I think people oftentimes, perceive things through their own lens of experience. And so if you haven't had that experience or don't have a familiarity with, these dynamics of power and control within systems, there's kind of like that blank stare of like, was it really that bad? Or, just stop, like get out of the, get out of the group, get out of the church. And it's like, yeah, it's not that easy. It's very much like a domestically violent relationship where you can't just leave for a myriad of reasons, but there's so much more complexity to it. So I think building that empathy can be key in terms of like how we interact with other people, and then even ourselves, just being really kind to ourselves.
Yes. And I want to get into all of that. And before we do, for our audience, who may not know your work or haven't read your book yet, you describe yourself, self-described Jezebel with a history in religious fundamentalism. What are the cliff notes that our audience needs to know about your history in terms of your life and religion and your family? You grew up in it, right?
Yes. Yeah. I was going to say, I think it's important to know that my personal life inspires my professional life. So yes, I grew up in it. There's never a day that I can remember that I wasn't a part of it. In my late elementary years, my dad became a director of a fundamentalist or evangelical Christian camp. And so we lived there on site. And so you can imagine there's like levels of isolation and very staunch dress codes and relationship codes and, all these things that we had to abide by. And after high school, I wanted what I was supposed to have was a man to get married to and then have kids, because that was really kind of the pinnacle of what my life could be as a woman in that system. And I know you've had like Tia Levings on the podcast, and her background is extremely similar to mine, including even the domestic violence components of it, though hers was far worse than what I experienced. And so all of those beliefs, that's what was living inside me. I worked at the church that I grew up in. I was on paid staff for about 4 to 5 years. And that's where I started to experience very overt spiritual abuse, just really awful, being screamed at, accused of all these things, intimidated. And then eventually, because of a relationship that I had that they didn't like, not because there was anything quote unquote wrong with it, but because it meant that the leaders didn't have as much power over me, it just like accelerated that abusive environment. So people were reporting back on me. I was being isolated in terms of like nobody was allowed to talk to me. My job description, like tasks were being stripped from me so I could have no communication or contact with people so that I couldn't be an influence on them because I was this quote unquote sinner. So I eventually quit that, and I had hoped to move away and go get my master's degree, but all the programs I applied to and all the jobs I applied to, which had really great interviews, all of a sudden, one by one, they started dropping and the doors were closing. And I found out much later after the fact, it was because members of that religious community had contacted these places to basically sell a story to them and as to why I should not be accepted into their program or hired on in that certain job. And so it kept me in that community because I had a ministry degree, and you can't do much with that. And so I knew that I had to get some sort of education in order to actually leave. In the interim, I took a job at a community college, which I hated, but it was the first time I was in a working environment that wasn't related to religion. And I started to see these stark contrasts of wow, they don't care what I do on the weekends, or they don't really care what I wear as long as it's just business professional or business casual on Fridays or, whatever that is. They appreciated my work. They wanted me to climb the ladder, to get into some director positions. And I just started to notice those contrasts, which was really nice. And that ultimately led me into searching for a different school to go to for my master's degree, which I did obtain in marriage and family therapy. I was already kind of deconstructing my faith at that time, but because I was still in the community, which was relatively small, I didn't have a lot of space to spread my wings and, try things out. So as soon as I got done with my master's degree, I moved here to Nashville, and I've been here for about 13 and a half years. And that was where I was able to really actively start doing things different. I did start off going to, they called it a progressive Southern Baptist church. I don't think that actually exists, but they did let me ask questions, which was really nice. And that is where I met a former partner, and we kind of left that church, or at least I did. I don't know if he ever went back together, but it was also an abusive relationship, which of course I didn't know this, at the very beginning, but it turned into that. And one night after I had kicked him out, I was sitting reading my journals, and I couldn't tell if he had said it or if God, or a higher power or a church leader had said it. So I started to recognize these similarities. Like when he would say, "You're so stupid, you're nothing without me." I was like, yeah, I know that because that's what I've been taught my entire life, and so seeing that was really pivotal. And then people just started landing in my office as a therapist and describing very similar situations, but not really having a lot of resources. So that was kind of my entryway into this work. And it's just kind of continued from then on. And I think 2016 is really when I think as a country, we started to see a lot of people asking questions, becoming very disillusioned due to the political candidate. And that's really what got me even more into this work. I wrote a manual for mental health professionals on how to work with religious trauma, started the Religious Trauma Institute, and then eventually started the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, and wrote a book. So that's a really short story. Yeah.
That's a great story with so much hope and redemption and full circle healing. And I'm just curious, when did you figure out that it was religious trauma that you were dealing with?
So for a long time, I wasn't able to pinpoint it as trauma. And I think what's important for people to know is that really it wasn't until the last 5 to 7 years that people were really understanding trauma in the way we understand it today. Prior to that, it had been a lot of cognitive behavioral work, gradual exposure to the things that were fearful. And what most people don't know is that even if you're a therapist, that does not mean that you are trained in trauma resolution or even trauma informed. We get one class in our training, and it's a crisis and trauma class most of the time. And you spend the majority of the time on the crisis stuff. So I had very little knowledge other than kind of the clinical knowledge that we were given through the diagnostic statistical manual. I came across this body worker who did a little seminar starting to talk about how trauma lives in the body. And I got all the books she recommended and I put them on my shelf because they looked really good, but I didn't read them.
Done that.
Yeah. But as I started to have clients that were coming in, I was like, you know what? I do know these are all symptoms of trauma. I didn't have the word of religious trauma or the phrase of religious trauma at that point, but I could recognize that the symptoms they had and the activation in their body and the responses they were having kind of in the moment very much coincided with trauma or PTSD, and even more so complex PTSD. So that's where I was really starting to put together the pieces of like, oh, I see these connections. But I would say for me, it was probably 2016, I think 2017, where I finally read every single one of those trauma books within a month that were on my shelf. And I was like, oh, not only does this describe my experience, this describes, my clients as well. So yeah, it's been probably about the last 7 or 8 years that I've really understood it as trauma. And then there is somebody who talked about religious trauma syndrome. I don't particularly like that phrase. There's some clinical reasons why I don't necessarily use it, but the term religious trauma I really like because it allows us then access to all of the trauma resources, all of the interventions and models and, backgrounds that we can use, and we don't have to recreate the wheel for that. And I think that's a really powerful thing. I always say religious trauma is trauma, just like cult trauma is trauma.
Right.
Yeah.
How are you defining trauma? Is it like a spectrum thing?
Yeah, there's not an official clinical definition of it, but the way I describe it is that trauma is anything that is too much, too fast, too soon, that overwhelms your nervous system and ability to cope and then come back to a place of safety. So that's extremely subjective because what might overwhelm your nervous system may not overwhelm mine and vice versa. And so that it might be a spectrum there, but I would say it's more subjective more than anything. I also like to clarify and say trauma is not the thing that happened to you, but the way that your body and nervous system responded to the thing that happened to you. And that is pretty much the standard nowadays, but prior to like 10 years ago, they really categorized it as an event. It's war, it's sexualized violence, it is childhood abuse. But then we're seeing people coming back from war, coming out of abusive childhoods that aren't exhibiting those traumatic symptoms. So we had to start to expand. Maybe it's not just this event that happened. Maybe there's other things going on.
Do you think traumatic events, like some people have normalized traumatic events or just can get acclimated to it? Like I know for me, what triggers me doesn't trigger Sarah. And there's certain things that I can actually remain calm in that Sarah's like, how are you? Well, I think I've been in a multitude of these situations.
Yeah.
Which is not traumatic to me. Do some people just naturally have, a tolerance for it, or they get acclimated to it, or it's just not
I think normalized is a good word.
Identified in their body as a traumatic event? I mean, and the reason I ask is there were some certain things when Sarah was pregnant, like certain things happened in the womb.
Yes.
Where the baby brain is formed, it's sensitive to its outside environment, and the blood is sent to the lower part of the brain or the cerebral part of the brain based on how it senses its environment. I don't know. I mean, it's out of my lane, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah. Well, any experience, how it lands on you and whether it results in trauma is a variety of different factors. Everything from like a genetic component, maybe a more sensitive DNA and things like that. It's access to safety, access to connection, coping mechanisms, history, things like that. So I would be hesitant to say like, okay, if you were, pregnant when you were in these really overwhelming situations, your kid is absolutely going to be traumatized. I don't think we can unequivocally say that because the other piece of it too is that there can be some really corrective moments, even from the time that they're born, that would kind of counteract what would happen in the womb in this situation, that would teach that infant's body, you are safe, you are okay. And that's done through holding. It's done through eye contact, and even sometimes like that gentle rocking, soothing voices. And when that becomes the norm then for a little baby's body, that is safety. And so we might not see that as trauma. Now, if that happened in the womb and they come out and they're put in the car seat and just left there, or, they don't get, physical touch, eye contact, things like that. Yeah, we would probably start to see, symptoms of trauma. But again, that's not like unequivocal. It is case by case.
Right.
I also think that it's important to note that when we are in these systems of power and control, so we're talking high control religion, cults, fundamentalism, there is a lot that is kind of quote unquote normalized because that's how we survive. So we have these things coming towards us, and our body acts in the service of our survival. So that means we don't necessarily get to have a breakdown, or we don't necessarily get to be in the bed for 5 days. And so there is a bit of that normalization, but it's not because like, oh, this is just like super normal and we just acclimate to it. No, that is in the service of survival. And that's why we see so many people coming out of these high control groups that then once they're literally safe, they kind of fall apart because their body's been carrying so much over time.
Right.
And finally they can release it.
So it's not that it's normalized, is that they've gotten used to disassociating or armoring up or whatever to not feel traumatized by continual abuse, for example.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
also, if you're in survival mode and it's a traumatic survival mode and you don't have permission to stand down, I called it sniper mode when I was going through mine. And once I kind of felt that my family was safe, and it was about 6 months in, that's when I started feeling everything.
Yeah.
And I felt it like right away. And I got sick and, all these things started happening.
Yeah. What's interesting is when we're in that survival mode, our body goes up and in like a bracing, right? And that is again in our survival. When we start to go, okay, I'm safe, we go down and out. And what happens in this up and in is that's where things get lodged. I mean, right? Like your body is hard. Like if you do that posture. And so when it softens, that's when it's like, oh, we've been carrying all this stuff. Now we can kind of move it around and we can actually work it out of us. But that's where people get very confused because they're like, but I'm safe. Everything is fine. I'm not in this dangerous situation anymore. And it's like, yes, that is the truth. And your body now feels safe enough to like tell the story of what's been going on.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I really loved about your book is that it linked together a number of concepts that we've covered in the podcast with specific experts like Alexander Stein taught us about attachment theory and how that related to cults and how cults keep you on the safe and then fearful hook. That's like the layman's terms as best I can do. And then also like, what Nippy was just saying about like giving birth and like doing all these skin to skin. And our kids, I feel like one of the things I'm really proud of is I feel like they're very strongly attached and we love them to bits and we're very connected to them. And they're very, and listen, my dad's a former school counselor, now psychotherapist. His partner is a doctor in child psychology. My mom's a family therapist. And they're all like always telling us how well attached and regulated they are, which is great, and I feel very proud of that. I feel like my relationship with my children, I don't really want them to ever know this because it's a lot of pressure to put on them. But in many ways, that connection kind of forced a healing for me that I didn't realize that I needed after leaving Nexium. And then your book helped me kind of put some pieces together, recognizing that, like I said at the beginning, even though it wasn't a religion, it was a fundamentalist structure. And I was, in many ways, on high alert and following a lot of the same patterns of abuse and hypervigilance and all these things. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, and what you speak about so eloquently in your book, what an adverse, hold on, let me get the right term. These are all new terms for me. Specifically, what an adverse religious experience is. And again, reminding our audience that it doesn't have to be a religion to experience one of those things. So can you educate us a little bit about that? Because that's one thing we haven't specifically talked about in the podcast.
Yeah, I'm actually going to pull up the definition that we came up with. Okay, so adverse religious experiences is a term that a colleague of mine and I created along with another group of therapists. And we wanted a term that kind of gave people some ways to organize their experiences. When people hear the term abuse, that can be a very like visceral reaction. And they're like, oh, no, I wasn't abused. Right. And so we wanted to come up with another term that would say, actually these experiences were really, really bad, but maybe they wouldn't traditionally be categorized as abuse. And so but they're impacted by them. So let's figure out what that is. That's where we started to come up with the adverse religious experiences, which is based a little bit off of the adverse childhood experiences research, which are you guys familiar with that?
No, tell us.
Okay. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, which we call ACEs for short, was done, I think, in the early 90s. And they basically were looking at what is it that causes some of these symptoms in adults, whether it is mental health, physical health, things like that. And they came up with a list of like 10 things. And I should note that research is now coming out saying, yeah, we need to add to that list because it can't just be these 10 things. But it was essentially, like experiencing physical abuse, witnessing domestic violence, a parent who's incarcerated or things like that, kind of this list of 10. And the higher your score was, their hypothesis was that the more likely it would be that you would have complex trauma or any sort of trauma. And so it's been kind of like seminal in the psychological field. They use it in education. They use it in a lot of different things to kind of gauge like how to conceptualize a specific student. So we liked that model in terms of recognizing that, the more kind of adverse experiences you had, the more likely it would be to have it result in trauma. However, we didn't want to have like a list of 10 things or 20 things or whatever. We wanted to kind of create some language that suggested if you had an adverse experience, then that's valid, whether it was 1 or 100. And we also wanted to say, hey, you could have a diagnosis of PTSD or CPTSD, even if you had one adverse experience, or you could have had 100 and not had resulting in trauma. So we wanted to kind of open that up a little bit. And so we came up with a definition, and this is a working definition. We are constantly evaluating to see, do we need to expand this, change this, however. But our working definition of adverse religious experiences is any experience of a religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy and or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, or psychological well-being. And I think you could substitute religious belief for like high control group belief, cult belief,
Right.
anything like that. You would be able to kind of use the same research and language to describe your experiences.
This podcast wouldn't happen without our amazing, supportive, generous patrons. Are you with us? Come find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/alittlebitculty for bonus episodes, exclusive content, and the occasional Zoom with our fan favorites from our past episodes. It's a lot of fun over there, people.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
You've heard from our sponsors. Now let's get back to A Little Bit Culty, shall we? One of the things that I thought your book laid out really well was what some of those things might be specifically in religion that we've touched on a little bit in other podcasts, like with Alice Gretchen and
Yes.
Will, who's our editor here in terms of Christianity and fundamentalism around, like, for example, please riff off this, if I screw up, I'm going to hell. Like, that is a really intense thing to put on a kid, right?
Or anyone.
Anyone, but specifically a kid. Like, what are some of the common things that you think people could relate to the most? That would be like the most, some of the, I know you can't say, if this happened, you're not going to be so definitive, but can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I kind of categorized them a bit in the book. And I didn't want to say like, this is all there is, but I kind of categorized them in terms of these are kind of the groupings that we see. So the first one is abstinence or purity culture. And I would actually expand that to say this is not just about like sexual practices, but when we talk about any purity culture, it's this definition of like, you have to be this way in order to be godly or, higher
Accepted.
level. Yeah, absolutely. And your worth is dependent on becoming this pure version of yourself. And there's usually some prototype that you're, supposed to ascend to. And that is a reflection then of your dedication and your commitment. And if you don't follow those rules, there are a whole host of consequences. I grew up in a abstinence only, purity culture. It was more than just you wait until you're married to have sex. It was like you see how far away you can stay from that line. So, for some people, it's like you can't hold hands, you can't even hug, you don't want to make the other person lust or stumble. I had made a commitment that I was not going to kiss until I was married, and that is not uncommon. And the long story short is, around the age of 30, I decided that's not what I'm going to do anymore. And I felt very good about that decision. And I shared that with my best friend at the time. And she screamed at me. We were in public. She just let loose on me. And one of the things she said is, you will forever regret this, and it will blemish your marriage if God even sees fit to give you a husband after what you did. And so it's like this very extreme response to these quote unquote impure acts. And I would say that my story is not an exception. It is very normal in those cultures. Yeah. So I think a lot of people, and I'm going to say women or those socialized female, really bore the brunt of that culture, kind of the purity culture standards. And I think that's true even in secular cultures, cults, things like that, where we see like rape culture, rape myths that come up, and women tend to bear the brunt. Well, what were you wearing? Things like that. So it's just heightened in a religious purity culture where God is also judging you. I listed, like spanking and corporal punishment as a potential adverse religious experience. There's a lot of like biblical teaching, quote unquote. I don't actually think it's biblical. That would say, you are commanded to hit your child. You are commanded to get them in line. You are supposed to do this because if you don't do this, your children are going to screw up and be taught that or believe that they can get away with anything. They don't have to submit to authority, things like that. Well, we know from the research that unequivocally, there is no reason for spanking. Like that never actually helps a child. And the actual likelihood of that child growing up and then committing physical acts against other people is higher when that's what they've experienced, because they've learned that this is how you deal with punishing people, is to physically assault them. So that is something that can be very adverse. Patriarchal kind of dynamics of this hierarchy and seeing people kind of like in various slots within that patriarchal culture. And I will say, outside of religion, patriarchy very much exists. Inside of religion, it exists as God's perfect design. And so you have that added layer of, well, God said it, so this is just what I have to do. But oftentimes that's where we see a lot of discrimination. It's where we see a lot of inequality, misogyny, injustices, silencing, kind of shaving off that autonomy, all those things. And we go, okay, yeah, I'm having to fragment myself if I don't meet this, picture of what I'm supposed to be. And therefore, my entire identity is wrapped around a man and God, if you're a woman, or if you're a man, because they are binary in those systems. There's men and women. That's it in most religious systems.
I had a note here. How does patriarchy put people into survival mode? Because that's something that I'd never heard before until I read your book. My mind was blown. Patriarchy and survival.
Yeah. The thing is, patriarchy is built on these hierarchies, right? So we have kind of this prototype at the top. And in the Western world, it is the cisgender, heterosexual, white male. And then everybody else is kind of down the line from that. And when we are not necessarily at that highest spot, but even if we are at the highest spot, there is so many expectations and rules to follow. Women do this, men do this. There's a definition that's wrapped around your identity. So, for instance, Black women are often like both hypersexualized and asexualized, and white women are often asexualized. It's like, this is just who you are, right? And so there's always kind of this constant surveillance to make sure that you are living within your prescribed role and within that prescribed order. And when we have that going for us, like that surveilling, that always makes us on guard, right? There's not room, like even you can see, even as I'm talking, I'm kind of like scrunching in, right? Because there's not room to like actually just be yourself, because you might be punished for that, or somebody might tell on you for that. And so I would say that patriarchy often puts us into this mode of survival, because we always are having to make sure that we are living within whatever the rules and consequences are coming out of that system. And then I think within, high control religions, especially when we add the God piece on there and we say, this is what your spiritual authority told you, this is right. And that means the consequences are also that much more exacerbated, i.e. hell or some sort of eternal torment. Then it puts even more surveillance on, because now this is a spiritual thing, not just like a how I live in the world.
The governing apparatus has been outsourced.
So convenient.
It's the boogeyman.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That surveillance. There's an analogy that I use sometimes. There is a concept called a panopticon, and they used it, I can't even tell you what century, in prisons and jails. And what it was is that the cells were in basically a circle, kind of stacked on top of each other. And in the middle of that was the guard's kind of little shack. And it had that type of glass around it where they could see out, but you can't see in. And what happened with that is that because nobody ever knew like where the guard was actually looking, they started self-policing and policing each other. So the guard really didn't have to do anything, because they did it all themselves, and they are surveilling each other and, making sure they have to stay in this very specific, chain of command and rules and stuff like that. And that we can see on, just at the outset, like that's pretty oppressive. That's pretty like you're extremely hyper vigilant all the time, because you never know if the guard is looking at you. You're hyper vigilant in keeping the rules. And I think that can be an analogy a little bit for patriarchy, and certainly any sort of system that has this all-powerful God who is constantly watching, or his people are constantly watching.
Right. Like for us, that was Keith and the Flying Monkeys constantly watching, which I think is kind of like what saved Nippy and I, because we were in Vancouver, because we didn't really have that in the same way.
Yes, that's huge.
Yeah, we didn't ever lived there. But when I was there, and certainly during trainings, like anytime I was in a training room, I was very aware of how I was presenting and looking, and then also like looking at Nippy going, stop doing that, you're gonna get in trouble, because he didn't give a shit. Well, not in the same way. He cared.
Not in the same way.
I cared about other things. Right.
I would take a nap.
Yeah, he would take a nap under the table. So we've talked about adverse religious experience, ARE. Mm-hmm. We've talked about HCR, high control religion. Tell me about religious scrupulosity.
Yeah, it is a real thing. And the closest diagnosis would be like an OCD diagnosis, but I think it would kind of be like a branch of OCD. So religious scrupulosity has some similar components, but is really focused on things like purity, moral value, and judgment, wanting to make sure that you're doing all the things right, not making mistakes, so that you don't have these eternal consequences. And so oftentimes that's going to look like really like shaming yourself if you're not kind of praying all day, or if you're not kind of doing the tenets, I'm going to read my Bible, I'm going to journal, I'm going to have this accountability partner and all these things. And it's this very rigid way of living as a way to make sure that you are not making mistakes, but what's really called sin, that you're not sinning and that you wouldn't then invite an eternal conscious torment. It looks like OCD because there is that sense of like compulsion to it and obsessiveness, right? Obsessiveness with perfection and making sure that you're sticking to the plan. And then also this compulsion to like, I must do this thing. And if I don't, there's going to be consequences for it. So, I've heard clients of mine say like, I would feel bad, like going out and spending time with friends, doing perfectly normal and, fine activities, but I would feel guilty about that because that could have been time that I could be like at home reading my Bible or, working these steps or, whatever you want to put in there. But it becomes this really obsessive compulsive piece. That would be religious scrupulosity. And I remember when I first realized like, oh, that's definitely my experience. I can see, I didn't have the mental health language at the time to like understand what was happening in me, but I knew I had extreme anxiety, which I thought was a flaw because it meant I wasn't trusting God enough. And so I would repeat these two specific Bible verses over and over and over and over to try to calm myself down. Not shockingly, that did not work. But that was, kind of this like compulsive behavior. And I know a lot of people feel anxiety coming out of these high control groups, but the amount of anxiety that decreased in me simply from not having to do these scrupulous behaviors, it was night and day difference. That was something that was easy for me to leave behind. But I know a lot of people really do struggle with that, even post high control groups.
Right. Yeah. Because you can leave the group, but you're still doing a lot of the behaviors unless you work with somebody like yourself or read your book. And that reminds me, one of the other things I had around leaving and anxiety. Can you talk about the relationship between anxiety and certainty after leaving?
Yeah. So one of the things that religion and cults really capitalize on is the human desire for certainty. Here are the steps that you need to follow in order to have this desired result. So that could be something like heaven or paradise. That could be an ascension. It could be, kind of the most desirable person. Whatever it is that group or cult is teaching is like the highest level to get to. So yeah, humans, we like to know what is good and bad. We like to know what is right or wrong or evil or holy. We like to know that. That actually in our bodies at least gives the illusion of safety. But I always say that fundamentalism is a coping mechanism for a dysregulated nervous system. So these really rigid practices that are supposed to give us certainty is actually just our way of coping to make sure we're getting regulated, which puts us automatically in a very anxiety producing state because we're never sure, have we done enough? Have we done it the right way? Did I make a mistake? Is somebody watching? We're constantly we're outsourcing like our sense of okayness and safety and stability, which can change at any moment, depending on who is in front of us. So we call it like an external locus of control. We're saying, okay, so Sarah, if you're happy with me, then I can be happy. And Nippy, if you're mad at me, now I'm really like, oh, what did I do? Right. So it's based on the person or people that I'm with rather than going, I have this internal sense of stability and safety. So when we have the external piece, that's where we do start to see increased anxiety, like exponentially, because we're trying to, achieve this goal, but we're having to look to other people to tell us if we're doing it right.
Is that coping with trauma, or is the origin of the coping is trauma always?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I would say it's the origin of it is the result of like feeling unsafe, unstable, overwhelmed, no sense of like groundedness. Whether or not that results in trauma is going to be based person to person. I will say this, the longer that you're in systems like that or in groups like that, where that's kind of your posture of how you live, I would say, and this is just a hypothesis, but I do know that research is being done about it, is that there is a greater likelihood that that would result in trauma because we have this ongoing, persistent, consistent, inescapable situation that we're in. And that does really prime our bodies to be traumatized.
I'm like totally in my head, like reliving certain experiences in NXIVM and being like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. Like what you're describing is our straight path. Like we had this straight path of like, these are the things you need to do. We didn't call it, God, but like to be more integrated, to be more joyful, to be non-reactive. And a lot of those things are, first of all, fucking impossible.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And they also kept moving the goalposts as all these groups do. And it was always decided by other people.
Yes.
Right? Other people were deciding whether you've worked through your issues or not.
Which is why I was dismissive of it.
But you were bought in we
different
bought
ways.
into different aspects
In different
of it.
ways, though. But and I assumed other people saw it the same way I did.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, these are theoretical, but these aren't really what they're, So I wouldn't say I was dismissive of it as much as, yeah, these are theoretical pursuits, like, optimal health. Like no one's, you want to develop the habits of health, but you're not going to be perfect because life gets in the way. And
Which
I don't
is
know.
a realistic statement. And if I can be so bold, a sense of denial, not because you're like trying to deny your experience, but the thought of like, other people have to be thinking the same as me, right?
Yes.
That's the denial piece. And it goes, that keeps us from seeing something that would feel like consciously intolerable. Like, oh my God, these people really believe that. Like, what do I even do with that? How do I get the word out? Like, how do I start to have conversations? Because if they really believe this, like, they're hooked in, and I don't know.
Well, I would witness that.
Yeah.
I would witness that, and I would go, guys, I don't think it necessarily means what you're making it. And they'd be frantic about it, and I wouldn't be.
Yeah.
I was in denial that this person was taking it that seriously. And I thought it was actually a dysfunction of them and not the system. So I would blame them and not the indoctrination they were going through. A big guy, take it with a grain of salt, as opposed to what about the fact that there's a system that they have to take for the grain of salt.
Also, there was moments where like I had like, just as a silly example, but I remember I've always been a really healthy eater. Perhaps like what's it called?
Orthorexia.
Yeah, orthorexia. Yeah, that I've self-diagnosed myself with that. I think I'm out of it, but I don't know. But anyway, during NXIVM, I never did the calorie counting thing like everybody else did, but I was eating very healthy. And I remember one day I was eating like some quinoa with avocado for lunch, and the calorie counting women were like, "Oh my God, that's so many calories." Keith said that we should only have blah 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 blah. And in my head, I'm going, Keith is not a fucking nutritionist. But I also knew that you can't say that because that's suppressive. It's an anti-tribute to Keith.
A perfect example, because I looked at what they were doing as crazy, and I looked at them as crazy, not the fact that there was a system dictating to them that they they that.
Right.
Yes.
You thought they were women with crazy eating issues versus that Keith was prescribing
I didn't
calorie
make it
intake.
Women with that. I thought they were on a goals program, and this is what they wanted to do. And when I remember one time I was eating something with like banana and peanut butter, and someone was like, "Do you know how many calories are in that?" I'm like, "No, I don't really care. I mean, I'm going to burn it off."
Yeah. I was proud of myself for never calorie counting.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's pretty interesting. I didn't necessarily catch that.
For more background on what brought us here, check out my page-turning memoir. It's called Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life. It's available on Amazon, Audible, and at most bookstores. And if you want to see that story in streaming form, you can watch both seasons of The Vow on HBO.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
Break time's over, people. Let's get back to this episode of A Little Bit Culty. It's a good one.
The other piece to that, though, is, they teach you in these groups that, like, if somebody questions you, like, that's persecution. And that's proof that, like, they don't understand you and they're not at the same place as you. And, you're at a higher level than they are. Or, this is why we need to like keep our group insulated. This is why we're separate from the world, whatever
Right.
their kind of rhetoric is. So then if you were to come and say, I don't think Keith's stuff is right in this example, right? He's not a nutritionist. Like, I don't really care what he says. That only confirms what they've
Right.
already been taught. And so they're actually more inclined to like grab hold tighter because now you've done the thing that they've essentially prophesied.
Yeah. They're prepared for that.
And you're right. And I think I subconsciously knew pick what was working for me and leave the rest and like bring what was working for me back to Vancouver.
Yes,
and not be all in because those things didn't make sense to me, but I didn't want to lose the good that I was gleaning.
Did you see the system as abusive?
No, God, no, I didn't see the system as abusive till...
That's what I'm getting is I didn't see it like that. I saw them as buying in.
They were more bought in than you.
Their buy-in is the problem.
Yeah, which I think is so common in any high control group anyways, like they really make the individual kind of the villain of their own story. So, like if you didn't see that, I mean, that's kind of your problem, it often silences people. And for sure, silences questions. There's not room for discussion in that.
And that actually was one of my questions, which relates. I was thinking about like what's happening in the nervous system, which I think you go into such great detail in the book. And obviously we can't recount it all here, but why is it so scary for people to be around other people who don't have the same belief system? And how does it relate to keeping people in and then getting out and also being dysregulated?
Yeah. So in systems like that, we learn that sameness is safe. So as long as we have the same belief or whatever, we're part of this same group, that indicates safety. But the people who don't believe that or are different, that equals danger. And so it goes back to like an isolated, insulated system. But it also means then that when we come in contact with different, which equals danger, our nervous system automatically goes into high alert. And our prefrontal cortex goes offline. So that's the part of our brain that helps us, make logical, rational decisions and, creates habits and can, clearly and calmly, work through something. That piece goes offline and we're kind of connecting to some other parts of our brain that really trigger that survival mode. So when I come in contact with somebody different, I'm already at this heightened awareness, getting ready to fight or flight or fawn or freeze because my body sees that person as dangerous and I want to stay alive. And so we kind of have then these internal resources that we pull from of those nervous system responses. And that clouds our entire, view of the situation and it rationalizes our need for doing anything, so if I scream at that person, that's a rationalized thing to do because I'm just trying to survive. I always say we can rationalize anything, even if it's not rational,
right,
when we're in that place of survival mode. Yeah. And so when I work with clients, some of the things we do is slowly dip one toe into difference of something, and help their body kind of ride that wave of activation and then settle back down. So it can feel oh, I was okay. Yeah, this thing was different and I was okay in that. And then we just add little tiny bits at a time to give their nervous system time to acclimate and what we might call kind of expand their window of tolerance so that then they can come in contact with people that are different and it doesn't seem so scary. And there's a variety of ways that I'll do that with people that are typically neutral, meaning I talk about this in the book, but I use The Bachelor as a way to do this because it's meaningless, right? It's just, fluff TV. But this was back before podcasts existed. So I would watch the episode of The Bachelor and then I would go to these 5 or 6 blogs. And they all had these differing opinions and they were different than mine, which used to make me very activated because that's different. So it's dangerous. I must be wrong. Fawn response big time. So what I started to do is go oh, this person has a different belief or opinion of this thing that really doesn't matter, has no impact on my day-to-day life, and let my body kind of figure out how to settle back into safety. And then I'd read this other one and this other one. And so I used just like a very neutral thing to start to see that difference doesn't have to be dangerous. And then I could translate that into other areas of my life that did have maybe a bit more consequence to them, and then move slowly into that over time. So that's usually how I encourage clients is we do take like a neutral, tiny plan and work that to try to grow that tolerance.
That's great. And that makes sense also to why social media is such a dumpster fire these days.
Good Lord.
It takes a bot to do it.
Yeah. And I see one comment and I want to like block somebody. I mean, how the opposite of humanitarian.
Yeah.
But one of the things I loved about your book, and I know is one of your major talking points, is that healing is not just something that you like do and then you're done, but it's lifelong and not linear. You want to speak to that?
So I think when we have this idea of I am healed, so there is like a period at the end of the sentence, or, the finish line, we, cross the tape at the finish line. Technically, what that suggests is then I will never be triggered. I will never think about it and have an emotional response. I will, it's basically like in the past, out of mind, whatever. And then when we inevitably get triggered or have a response or whatever, we shame ourselves. Oh God, the work that I did wasn't effective. I'm still broken, all these things. And we make it about ourselves and the terrible job that we've done. When we leave it open-ended, we say this is a lifelong process. It gives us space to not only remove that shame, but it gives us space to consider that every moment can be a healing moment. So every time I have a different response to something or lean into connection instead of isolation or whatever it might be, that's seen as a moment of healing. And then when I'm triggered, if I have, if I'm able to employ this coping mechanism or that or whatever, that is a moment of healing. It's not if I get triggered, it's when I get triggered. And so when we have that open-ended piece, it allows us then much more self-compassion to say, oh yeah, of course. Like, of course this thing would trigger me. It's this holiday, or it's this, I'm walking into this store, this music was heard, whatever it is. And we go, okay, how do I need to, kind of gather my resources to find a sense of safety and grounding, which feels much more hopeful and doable and like natural just to the human life than I am done and I will never deal with this again. I would say if that is your mindset, you will be either suppressing a lot or probably lashing out at people a lot.
I'll speak for myself. I've done both, especially when I've heard things like, oh, you should be healed by now or whatever. Like, no, it's an ongoing journey. And how does that relate to embodiment, which you speak a lot about in your book?
Yes. So I really believe that one of the tactics that high control groups use is like a divorce from your body. Your body is evil. You can't trust your instincts. You can't trust your desires. Those are fleshly. Like you've got, again, that external locus of control. That's a big piece of how high control group leaders work. So when we look at embodiment, it's almost like a rebellion against everything that we've been seeped into, and starting to use our body as a source of information, as, like a source of like, I can create safety and stability within myself. I can listen to the cues of my body and perhaps give myself what I need, so that when my stomach growls, I can go eat. If I'm getting really tired, I can go to sleep or I can rest. And so I really feel like embodiment is, I wouldn't say the key to healing, but it is extremely important because trauma doesn't just live in our brain. It lives in our bodies. And so that means that we have to get back into our bodies to resolve how that trauma has lived there. And then keep using our bodies to like reclaim things like pleasure and enjoyment and relationship, everything.
I'm going to send this episode and your book to every ex-Nexium member that's still talking to me, because so much of what we were taught was that you had to override those things because it was just a viscera.
Because they were rooted in materialism.
And rooted in materialism. And the more you could override it, specifically like not peeing for lengths of time would mean you had more character.
Yes.
Fuck that.
That was something I like. I was shocked. I challenged myself like for a week. I was like, I'm going to use the restroom every time I have to. And the amount of times I didn't was like sad and shocking to me. And I was like, this has to change.
Wow.
Like it's not like a prize, like to be won. Oh, I did these 12 things. Now I can go to the bathroom. No, like that's just our body's way of saying we got to like eliminate something and then get back to what you're doing, like not a big deal.
I still feel guilty when I take a nap, and I love to nap, and I still feel like I'm, say it.
What?
Say it.
What?
Say it. I know you want to.
Say anything.
I know. I can feel it.
Just hanging out.
Okay. Laura, do you take?
That's denial.
Are you taking private clients? I want to see you.
What do you think I was going to say?
I was just thinking about my spa.
Oh, you set up a spa downstairs.
Yeah, I'm sleeping in the guest suite right now because I have this cough, and he calls it my spa.
Yeah, that's amazing.
She's down there exfoliating every day, and
great, good for you. Keep it up.
I think that you'll be the first to know, since we haven't told our podcast audience, that Nippy and I are getting a divorce, a sleep divorce.
A sleep divorce.
Now that I know the guest room is so comfortable, thanks to my cough, I think I'm just going to stay there because
the kids all come in with me.
Because I snore, apparently.
And I'm up at 5:45 making breakfast.
No, I actually do miss sleeping in the same bed as Nippy. It's temporary. It's only been a week, but he calls it the spa, but it's I'm joking, but it's reminiscent of those days where like anything that was body indulgent was called satiative, and you were either satiating or you were on purpose and on your goals.
Yeah. And that is a way to control. I know I say it in the book a couple times, like if they can control things, like, and create messaging around our body, around our sexuality, those are so much the essence of who we are, which means that they then have control of all of who we are.
Right.
And that is the way that they gain power and control.
You just reminded me of something. In your book, you said something about how Nadia Bolz-Weber said on a podcast and the interviewer was asking, why are they so concerned about sexuality? Was that our podcast?
No, I think it was Pete Holmes.
Okay, because I also asked her the same thing. I was also like,
did you?
That was one of the first episodes we did about religion. And I'm like, just so, I was at the beginning of this pod, very naive to just the levels of abuse in Christianity and specifically. So I was asking very basic questions.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, I heard that. I think it was Pete Holmes, You Made It Weird. But it was right before her book Shameless came out. And so she was kind of doing the podcast circuit or whatnot. And I was floored at that time because it gave me language to put together what was happening. And I think she's entirely correct, to have control over that. It's a competition between, religion or high control groups and the body, essentially.
Listeners, go back and listen to we call her the Bolz-Weber. That's one of our favorite. The Bolz-Weber, favorite episode.
The Bolz-Weber. I love it.
Final couple things. What chaps your ass the most about religion and specifically your lane? Yeah.
Okay. This is a whole other conversation, so I won't have it all here. But what chaps my ass is the fact that they believe that their beliefs are correct and everybody needs to have them. And we are starting to see it play out in our government and schools and a whole host of other places. And it's scary and infuriating all at the same time.
Fair.
Yeah.
I'll second that emotion. And anything that you want our listeners to know about your book, or any major takeaway that we didn't cover that you'd like to leave? We've been told we use the word nugget too much, but I'm going to say any nuggets. I use the word nuggets too much, not Nippy. Any nuggets, golden nuggets of wisdom.
Yes. Well, it sounds very simple, but really the hope of my entire book was that people would know that healing is possible and that doing this is allowing you to actually live. That is the goal of healing, is to live. And even though we have that ongoing process of healing, you get to live in all the in-between spaces. You don't have to wait till you're healed to live. You get to do it simultaneously. And I think that's really important. And I think that's why people are like, I don't even know if I want to start this because it's going to take over my life. And I'm like, for a little while it might, but then you start living your healing out. And that's why my dissertation was called The Living Experience of Healing, because it's a living process.
Well, it's kind of like working out. You just have to incorporate it into your life. And then as you do it, it enhances your life.
If there's one healing exercise that people could do on a day-to-day basis, post any of these things, what might it be?
Okay, I'm going to go with something simple. And I think I talk about it in the book. I can't remember anymore. But I use this for when you're kind of feeling anxious, kind of like you're not really present, you're dissociating, you're having a hard time calming down, whatever that is. And it literally just is to pick a color, any color. So I have a blue chair next to me, so we'll do blue. And wherever you are at in your space is you then find every single blue thing that is around you. And it can be any color, and you can do multiple colors, one after the other. And the goal of this is to not only get you back into the present, the here and now, it's to start to create a sense of safety inside of you. And most of the time you'll notice like, okay, as I'm going around, like I can't be dissociated and also here in the present moment looking for blue, right? So it gets us back into our bodies and then giving ourselves kind of some resources to say, okay, I'm here, I'm in the present, I'm right now. I'm not back in that situation. I'm not back with that person. I'm not back in that messaging. I am here, and I'm going to just let myself take as much time as I need to kind of let my eyes linger on every single thing. And then maybe I need to pick orange or, white or green or whatever it is. And just, it helps us calm ourselves down. So then we actually have choices that we can make rather than being reactive and responding out of desperation and survival.
That sounds great. And I wanted to tell you, I have a lot of other questions, but I'm going to save them for if you come back and do a Q&A. Specifically, I want to talk to you about grief and acceptance and all these other things that you talk about in great detail in your book. Obviously, we'll encourage everyone to read it. It's on Audible. Did you narrate it?
I did. Yes.
You did narrate it. Okay. So you narrated it, did a great job. I listened to it at 2-point speed. So I wasn't sure if it was your voice. I do that too. Yeah, I just, it's how my brain works.
It's have a love-hate relationship with that feature.
Yeah. Well, it's good because you can read a book in 4 or 5 hours, or listen to a book.
Exactly.
It's available wherever books are sold, I'm assuming.
Yes, it is. Yep.
And where else can people find you? And we'll put them in our show notes also.
Yeah. So I'm most active on Instagram. My handle is Dr. Laura E. Anderson. But if you want to kind of get the breadth of my work and resources and things like that, I would go to my website, which is drlauraeanderson.com. And just a little plug, I run a company called the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. You can also, it's on my site that I just mentioned. But we specialize in working with people who are coming out of high control religion, cults, fundamentalism, any other high control systems or relationships built on dynamics of power and control. And that is often tricky because when we're looking for help and support, what frustrates people the most is that I have to explain this all to you or convince you that it really was that bad. And so what we offer is starting at a baseline of going, yep, it was bad. You don't have to convince me of that. In fact, you don't even have to explain all the ins and outs. We will work with this through a body-based and nervous system-based lens and try to get you back into your body and feeling safety and resolve some of how that is living in you. So yeah, that's the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. It is exclusively online, and we have a myriad of coaches with different backgrounds and specialties and things like that, and price points as well.
We'll put all of that in our show notes. We'd love to invite you back to our live Q&A with our Patreon diehards.
Yes.
And until then, will you hold up a copy of your book?
Yes, here it is.
Since I don't have my copy with me, will you read what I wrote on the back?
Yes. Okay, here's Sarah's endorsement. She says, in When Religion Hurts You, Dr. Laura Anderson draws on clinical research, stories from clients, and her own experience to show how individuals can embark on a journey of healing after leaving a high-demand, high-control religious system. She offers markers of healing for those coming out of painful religious experiences and hope for finding wholeness after religious trauma. A must-have for anyone in the muddy aftermath of their exit from high control or extreme religious groups.
I agree with that. It's a must-have. I should buy it in bulk and give it to everybody next year. Merry Christmas.
I love it.
To you.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Just a subtle gift.
Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom.
Thank you, Dr. Laura.
I feel like this is such a gift that I selfishly get to, unpack some of our own shit at the same time. So thank you.
Yeah.
Like what you hear, do you? Give us a rating, a review, and subscribe on iTunes. Every little bit helps us get this cult awareness content out there. Smash that subscribe button. You know you want to.
Thank you, everybody. I hope that you read the book and join us over on Patreon, where we will be following up with Dr. Laura Anderson in a live Q&A.
No doubt, no doubt.
Let us know what you think. Please don't forget to write us a review, subscribe, all that stuff. It really does help keep the pod going.
Smash that like button.
Till next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Till next time, thank you for listening to this week's episode of
A Little Bit Culty.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean. I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We're heading over to patreon.com/a-little-bit-culty now to discuss this episode. In the meantime, dear listener, please remember, this podcast is solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. It's not intended as a substitute for real medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. For cult recovery resources and to learn more about seeking safely in this culty world, check out alittlebitculty.com/culty resources, and don't miss Sarah's TED Talk called How Cult Literate Are You? Great stuff.
A Little Bit Culty is a Trace 120 production, executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, in collaboration with producer Will Rutherford at Citizens of Sound and our co-creator and show chaplain/bodyguard, Jess Tardy. Our show writer is Holly Zadra, and our theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant.